Thanks for coming out. My name is Rob Crawford, and I'm co-founder and coordinator of the Washington State Religious Campaign Against Torture. And we have an event tonight that reflects, I think, a very unique time in our history. And that is that ever since 2009, there has been various attempts to try to understand the adoption of what most commentators are able to identify as U.S.-sponsored torture, usually discussed in the press during the Bush-Cheney years as enhanced interrogation or brutal interrogation, but which many impartial observers now recognize as torture. So since 2009, there's been an attempt to try to understand how that happened in the United States. And so the Washington State Religious Campaign Against Torture was created in 2007. We were affiliated with the National Religious Campaign Against Torture. And through many of the early years of developing an anti-torture movement, we relied on reports of human rights organizations and others who had documented, investigative reporters, who had documented various aspects of how the United States came to adopt the practice of torture. In 2008, the Senate Armed Services Committee issued a report. It was actually released in early 2009, which was a very thorough report, heavily redacted. And then for several years, there was no additional report that unveiled the genesis, the way it happened, the scope of the programs that were involved, both military and security agencies, until the Constitution Project. The Constitution Project assembled and I'm going to introduce two members of the Constitution Project in a moment, assembled a task force on detainee treatment. And to date, this task force is the most comprehensive report we have available on the scope, practice of U.S. torture. This is especially an important moment in our history. The report came out last year, and this is an especially important moment in our history. For the last 5 years, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Senate Intelligence Committee, had been working on a report on the CIA dimension of this torture program. And they finally, in December 2012, over a year and a half ago now almost, had actually adopted this report. And you may have remembered that just a month ago, there was quite a controversy when Dianne Feinstein, and the chair of the Senate committee, which had just voted to approve the report and to not only to approve the report, but to release the report to the public, there was quite a controversy when Dianne Feinstein went on the Senate floor and accused the CIA of trying to intimidate the committee. It was really an extraordinary moment, and if you don't know about the story, please go back and review it, because it was a very unusual moment in the history of this attempting to try to understand, to know, to reveal the information that we need to do it. So the committee, it was a bipartisan vote. The Washington State Religious Campaign issued a press release in April, which applauded the committee for voting to release this report. And now the report is, promises to be the most comprehensive report that we have. sits in the White House, where the CIA is going over to recommend final redactions. President Obama has said that he's in favor of releasing the report. We were expecting it before now. I think it's been there since early April. We don't know how long it will take. The Washington State Religious Campaign Against Torture is calling upon the president to release the summary of the report. It's a 500-page summary of a 6,000-page report, by the way. So the Washington State Religious Campaign has joined many other human rights groups, civil society organizations, and others to call for the release of the report. So it will be an extraordinarily important moment. There's been a lot of rumors about what the report will say, in particular, there's been a lot of attention to the claim that the report will refute the CIA's claim that these, what they call enhanced interrogation, was useful in preventing terrorist attacks against the United States. And for the last several years, it seems that the torture issue won't go away, and we argue that the torture issue won't go away because, among other reasons, that there's still so much that's unresolved in terms of who did what, when, and where. How did this thing happen? How did we deviate from the course of abiding by the Geneva Conventions? How did the CIA undertake these programs? And importantly, what are the consequences for our nation of taking up the torture practice? So I won't say any more at this point, except that we are prepared for the release of the report and hope to engage the citizens of Seattle, greater Seattle area, in open discussion and debate about the report when it comes out. We believe it's an important milestone in our coming to terms in one way or another of dealing with the problem of U.S. torture. So let me turn this over to Brigadier General David Irvine, who was a member of the Constitution Project's task force, and he will tell you about what was in fact the most important civil society report to date on the U.S. torture issue. General Irvine. I'm actually going to jump you. Sorry. Senior Counsel of the Constitution Project, Scott Ream, will speak first.
Thanks very much, Rob. That was entirely my fault, not Rob's. And thanks very much to the Washington State Religious Campaign Against Torture. We're thrilled to be here. I thought it might make sense for me to go first so that I can give you a little context about the Constitution Project, who the organization is, how the task force on detainee treatment came about. And then Brigadier General Irvine will talk a little bit more about the project itself. He was, as Rob said, a member of our task force. So the Constitution Project is a small nonprofit in Washington, D.C. Our sort of niche is we bring together experts and practitioners from across the political spectrum to make consensus recommendations about how best to protect constitutional rights and civil liberties in a variety of contexts, many of which involve national security programs and practices. We organize the experts that we work with in a variety of ways. We have standing committees that address specific issues. The task force on detainee treatment is another sort of form that we've used in the past. It was a sort of time-limited task force, though members have continued to work very hard since the task force wrapped up to advocate for its recommendations. The impetus for the task force was really the Obama administration's decision shortly after coming into office to quote unquote look forward when it came to post 9/11 detainee treatment and questions of abuse. Rather than engage in honest and informed conversation about what had happened. When TCP learned that that was the administration's position, that there was unlikely to be anything that came out of Congress in terms of a body to examine that period, the organization decided to launch the Task Force on Detainee Treatment Project. And we did that by recruiting members with diverse political views and expertise, including in law, diplomacy, the military, Brigadier General Irvine, medicine, ethics, experience in high levels of the executive branch and Congress. There were 11 members on the task force, 4 to 6 staff at various times, led by, in the end, New York Times journalist Nick Lewis. The task force spent 2 years studying these issues. They looked at detainee treatment across a variety of geographic theaters, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Guantanamo, Eastern and Western Europe. They examined quite a broad time period, the late Clinton years through the early Obama years. They did not have access to classified information nor subpoena power, so their report was based entirely on the public record, supplemented by interviews. The task force conducted over 100 interviews, including with former Guantanamo detainees, interrogators, military personnel, policymakers, and a host of others. The report, which, as Rob said, was released last April, it's a 600-page report. It's available on our website, actually a dedicated website for the task force, which is detaineetaskforce.org. The report traces a variety of different substantive issues around detainee treatment and makes a series of recommendations at the end, really aimed at preventing a return to the kind of abuse that the task force determined occurred in the post-9/11 years. You'll hear more about these in a minute, but just a few of those recommendations include the need for increased transparency around the post-9/11 era, in particular, swift and minimally redacted release of the Senate Intelligence Committee's report, closing loopholes in statutes that very smart lawyers seized on and exploited through what I would call acrobatic lawyering, prohibiting reliance on medical providers' an opinion that an interrogation technique is safe, and because of that opinion, lawyers would find that the interrogation technique is lawful, and increased transparency at the Office of Legal Counsel for the way in which these sorts of internal rules and laws governing the executive branch are formed. I want to close by saying that we won't know the full scope of what reforms are necessary, notwithstanding I think the task force's very good set of recommendations, until we know the full scope of what happened. I also don't think we're likely to see any meaningful reform or even effort at reform, at least not any that requires Congress or this administration to be proactive, without a shift in public opinion on torture and the need to prevent it going forward. Right now, as many of you probably know, a slight majority of people actually support the use of torture in narrow circumstances, and that number has actually risen since President Obama took office. I think they do, or at least that ratio is the way it is, and has moved the way it has, because the full truth of what happened in the aftermath of 9/11 remains largely secret. And frankly, much of what's in the public space isn't well known, I think, or understood. Pop culture, shows like 24, movies like Zero Dark 30, along with former CIA officials' memoirs, tend to be the substance of the information that drives the debate. And a debate on those terms often ends up centering on entirely hypothetical and, frankly, divorced from reality, ticking bomb scenarios. And that debate focused on those terms isn't going to get us very far. So we need to have an honest and thorough conversation about what happened in the aftermath of 9/11, about what the United States did in the name of the American public. Our task force on detainee treatment was an effort to kickstart that conversation, and I'll turn it over now to Brigadier General Irvine to tell you a little bit more about the report itself.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. Let me just give you a little bit of information about me and how I became involved with this task force. I spent 18 years of the years that I was an Army reservist holding down a faculty assignment with the Army Intelligence School, during which time I taught prisoner of war interrogation and military law to probably 1,000, 1,200 soldiers, airmen, and Marines. And never before in our history as a nation has there been the kind of unusual and remarkable circumstance that took place in our country as the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq unfolded. I want to just make a comment relative to something that Scott mentioned. He said that today there is a larger majority of Americans who believe that brutal interrogation is acceptable, that it's necessary, and that it has produced information that has saved thousands of lives, more people today than ever before since 2002. And I'm reminded of a bit of history in connection with that. In the Civil War, the Battle of the Wilderness, for the first time, the United States Army failed for a period of weeks to submit the daily morning report of the status of forces who were available for service that day. This goes on every day in any military operation around the world. And the reason the morning reports were suspended was, in the words of one of the senior commanders on the ground, if the nation knew the kinds of casualties that we have experienced, they would not tolerate it. And I believe the same can be said with respect to our treatment of prisoners during this dozen years that we have been involved in the so-called war on terror. Most people believe that whatever we have done is not torture, has been effective, has produced useful intelligence, has saved thousands, if not tens of thousands, of lives. One of the reasons they believe this is that they don't know anything else. We have been told over and over for years and years by very senior officials in the government that all of these allegations and representations are true. And paralleling those representations is usually this kind of a statement. If I could only tell you what I know, you would understand why it was necessary for us to go to the dark side, and you would understand why it has been so successful and so necessary for our national security. But I can't tell you those things because they are classified. As Scott mentioned, the task force of which I was a part did not have access to classified information. We performed our study and analysis based on information that is available in the public record. The report that we produced is this document. It's about 600 pages long. It's heavily footnoted. It is the most authoritative effort to date to document how we have conducted our treatment of prisoners we took in the war on terror, and how we have approached the practice of interrogation during this time. This evening, I will probably be referring not to detainees, but to prisoners, because these guys at Guantanamo and other places around the world are not there, have not been there for 12 years on the basis of a traffic ticket. They weren't detained overnight. They are prisoners. We can debate, as people have debated, what their actual status technically, legally, may be or ought to be under the Geneva Conventions. But the fact is, they are our prisoners. And one of the first things that we did as a as those at the top who made these decisions proceeded, one of the first things they did was to degrade the language. And by referring to these men as detainees rather than as the prisoners they have been, is that it made it easier to sell what was being done as something that was perhaps slightly murky, but not illegal. And it certainly was not torture, because we don't do that as a nation, and we wouldn't authorize torture as a nation. So in the 2 years that our task force looked at the public record to determine what had happened, we reached some fairly significant conclusions. The most significant conclusion that we reached, and we made ultimately 24 findings and recommendations as a result of our study, and I should say that all of these, 23 of the 24, were unanimous recommendations of an 11-member bipartisan commission. The first finding, and this is a unanimous finding of the commission, that the United States, in many instances, used interrogation techniques that constitute torture. And we debated a long time about language, and we debated how we should characterize what we were seeing and what we were observing. And we finally made the decision that we should just be very plain about what we found and what we characterized it to be. A second fuzzing of the language that became important was to refer to these interrogation techniques as enhanced interrogation, when in reality used singly, or as more frequently was the experience overseas in many theaters that Scott has described. They were used in combination and simultaneously. And that cumulative effect of psychological and physical deterioration of the victims who were treated that way, indeed, in our experience and in our conclusion, can only be called for what it was, which is torture. There was also another category of behavior and treatment that I should note as well, and that was a range of other behaviors and ways of treating people that fall under the category of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. And both of those categories of action violate U.S. law and violate international treaty. That kind of conduct was expressly counter to the values of the Constitution and of the nation. The second unanimous finding that we reached was that the nation's most senior officials, through some of their actions and failures in the months immediately following the September 11 attacks, bear ultimate responsibility for allowing and contributing to the illegal use of many of these techniques. Responsibility for those decisions rests on other officials and military leaders as well. But we felt it was important, as we issued this report, to be very clear that what we had seen and what happened was not the work of a few bad apples. It followed a trail of breadcrumbs all the way to the White House. The third significant finding that we unanimously reached, and this is really important, we believe, there is no firm or persuasive evidence that the widespread use of brutal or harsh interrogation techniques by U.S. forces produced significant information of value. There is substantial evidence in the public record that much of the information adduced from enhanced interrogation or torture light or just plain torture, however you choose to designate it, was not useful or reliable. We found no clear evidence in the public record that torture produced more useful information than conventional methods of interrogation or that it saved lives. We also found unanimously that U.S. officials involved with detention at CIA black sites committed acts of torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. And the thing that is difficult to deal with respect to those kinds of findings is that that kind of conduct, as I said earlier, violates existing federal law and international treaties to which we are a signatory. And those kinds of practices have been denounced by the United States as torture when practiced by other states. So we believe that the report, which is available online, is a significant and very useful research device for people interested in this subject. We believe that it's important that all Americans take an interest in this subject, because what was done in all of our names. And the price that we have paid as a nation for going to the dark side and abandoning law and values has been to forfeit, to a considerable degree, unfortunately, the moral leadership that is so important as we proclaim ourselves to be the only surviving superpower in a world that's a very, very dangerous place. And only by understanding what we have done and how it came to have happened can we ever hope, in our opinion, as the task force, to avoid the temptation, as will surely be there inevitably in the future, when some other terrorist attack raises the cry publicly to do whatever is necessary to protect the nation, even if it means sacrificing our law, our tradition, our values, for the sake of a little more security. There's much more that could be said, but I'm happy to respond to questions if any of you have them that you'd like to propose.
Pop culture. I don't know how you break that one. I like your comments, Scott, about pop culture and how it impacts the perception of reality. I wish there was something we could do about that.
Well, let me take that one step further. Pop culture had a fair amount to do with the approval of techniques that were employed at Guantanamo. As various committees sat around a table, people who you would expect would be somewhat immune to pop culture, but these were high-ranking military officers, civilian people, who determined that if it worked for Jack Bauer, it surely would work for us. And the degree to which programs like 24 influenced what was going on cannot be overestimated in my view. And I'll just give you an example of the anecdotal way this built. In 2003, when Iraq was a mission accomplished, and all of a sudden things in that country began to fall apart, the word went out from the military headquarters there that the gloves had to come off, because this insurgency that we were seeing evidence of as it began to grow was something that no one could explain or account for, that we didn't have a grip over. And so better, more intelligence was needed to allow the military leadership in Iraq to deal with this problem. And already in Afghanistan, there had been a determination that in Afghanistan, at least, Geneva, for reasons I won't bore you with, would not apply. But that was never the case in Iraq. Geneva clearly always applied in Iraq. Nevertheless, the gloves have to come off, and that was a directive that went down to the field. In one unit where that directive was considered, the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, the lead interrogator for that regiment was discussing how the interrogators assigned to the 3rd Cav could more effectively do their job. What could they do that would break the will of these people who refused to concede any information that they thought would be useful? How could they get them to talk? And one young private or corporal said, well, you know, when I was 12 years old, my older brother would stuff me into a sleeping bag, and he would throw that sleeping bag over me, and I just felt like I was suffocating, and it was all I could do to just not go crazy, and it was the worst thing that I experienced. Well, the sleeping bag technique became an interrogation device in the 3rd Cav. And that device was applied to an Iraqi major general who turned himself in voluntarily. And there's a very curious story about this. General Abdul Mahoush had 2 sons, and he had been a major general in the Iraqi army, which of course we deactivated and put out of business. But his 2 boys had been taken prisoner by the American forces, and he was interested in finding out where they were and in getting them back. And so he showed up at the headquarters of one unit and began asking for these kids' whereabouts. And the people he talked to there said, well, we don't know anything about him, but 3rd Cav's down the street. Why don't you go down and talk to them and see what they can tell you? Which he then did. He identified himself, he told them who he was, and he had a conversation with Chief Louis Welshoffer, who was the interrogator in charge at that time. And as they talked, Welshoffer became convinced, for whatever reason, that Mahoush was in reality a leader of the insurgent movement in that area. He arrested him, threw him into a prisoner compound with about 600 other Iraqi prisoners. And then the story of what happened after that becomes pretty instructive. Mahoush was brought out in front of that group of prisoners. All of them, by the way, knew who he was and that he was a man of importance in the area, that he was a high-ranking Iraqi military officer. Welshoffer had him kneel in front of him, and in front of this compound, slapped him across the face and knocked him over. At the court-martial proceeding, Welshoffer was asked why he had done that. And he said, well, I needed to show him who was in charge. I was in charge, he wasn't. And I needed the other people who were in that compound to understand that I was in charge, he was not, nor were they. And I needed to let him know who the boss was. Well, the next step in the Welshoffer interrogation was a visitation by what was called a Scorpion team. That evidently was a group of Iraqi nationals who had been recruited by the Army to do some of the dirty work that American troops did not want to get involved in. The Scorpions showed up. Welshoffer was present, observing all of this. They beat the daylights out of Mahoush and fractured about 6 or 7 of his ribs. It was all he could do to stagger out, and he had to be helped back to where he was supposed to be living. And all of this took place in the space of about 3 days. That first interrogation, the beating interrogation, produced nothing. And so the next step in the interrogation was to waterboard him. Now, all of us have heard over and over again that there were only 3 or 4 prisoners, my word, who were given the waterboard treatment. That simply is not true. Mahoush was one who was waterboarded, and waterboarding didn't produce the information that Welshoffer thought he ought to get. So the third interview the following day was an interesting interview. Mahoush at that point was so weak and so badly damaged, he was a big guy. He had to be almost carried into the interrogation room by 2 American soldiers who were assigned to get him there. And he was told that one of his sons was outside and that he would be permitted to have a short visit with his son if he would cooperate and provide the information that Welshofer was looking for. But he was told very carefully, you may not tell your boy anything about how you are being treated here, how we're dealing with you, how we're interrogating you. You keep it strictly to his, how he is, and that was that. And so the boy was brought in, and they spoke for a few minutes, and very quickly Mahoush violated the terms of that arrangement, and the guards immediately escorted the boy out. And the next thing Mahoush heard was a pistol shot. Didn't know, for all he knew, they had just killed his son. And still, he wasn't saying anything. So he was given the sleeping bag interrogation technique. And the bag was put around him, put over him, put down. It was tied around him. He was pushed onto the floor on his stomach. And Welshofer was sitting on his back. And for about 15 minutes, they had this exchange. He would be asked questions, and he wasn't saying anything. And so at one point, he passed out, and the interrogators thought they had killed him. They were scared to death. They pulled him out of the sleeping bag and slapped him around to see if he would respond. And finally, he showed some signs of life. And so they decided to put him back in the sleeping bag and go to it again. And they did that, tied him back in the sleeping bag, and this time Welshofer sat on his stomach. The officer was on his back. And he would put his hand over the mouth area of the sleeping bag, and he would ask a question, and then he would allow Mahoush to answer it. And this went on for about 5 minutes. And somebody asked him at the court-martial, well, why were you doing that? And he said, because if I didn't put my hand that way, he would be pleading to Allah to save his life, and that wasn't acceptable. So I wanted to make sure he wasn't even given an opportunity to express that spiritual request for intervention or whatever it may have been. After 5 minutes, everything inside the sleeping bag just went blank. And they were really nervous about that. So they pulled the bag off and tried to revive him, but he was dead. And this was all a method of interrogating that was off the cuff, off the books, that was anecdotal, because a private, as a young kid, had been put into a sleeping bag by an older brother, had the daylight scared out of him, and he figured, boy, if it worked on me, it'll work on anybody. And it killed an Iraqi officer who was entitled to the protection of the Geneva Conventions and absolutely did not get it. Stories like this occurred over and over and over and over again throughout the Iraqi theater. And yet most Americans have no idea what enhanced interrogation really means, or how badly it served the nation, and how little we got as a consequence. So, thank you very much.